Welcome to the Advanced Podcast. I'm Vikas Pota, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us. My guest today has dedicated her life to opening school doors for girls across Africa. Lucy Lake is the former CEO of CAMFED, the Campaign for Female Education. She spent 30 years building and leading CAMFED to be a vehicle for girls' education and women's leadership in Africa. Last year, she stepped aside from CAMFED and has now joined the Yidan Prize Foundation. As a former laureate of the Yidan Prize, she has been invited to lead the foundation's efforts to highlight best practices and engage the global community committed to creating a better world through education. Lucy is a founding member and former co-chair of the United Nations Girls Education Initiative and has served on the high-level steering group of the Education Commission's Workforce Initiative and the advisory board of the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report. She serves on the Malala Fund board and represents private foundations on the board of the Global Partnership for Education. Few people understand the link between education, dignity, and lasting change as clearly as she does, and I'm delighted she is with us today. Please join me in welcoming Lucy to the Advanced Podcast. I'm really excited that today we have Lucy Lake with us. Lucy is a hero of mine. What she has done to the world of girls' education is just incredible. And now she's gone on to pastures new and thinking about, what those lessons over 30 years have been with regards to building a non-profit organization, mainly in Africa, but based in the UK, and now on a more global role to evangelize all the success and all the great things that are happening in the world of education through the Yidan Prize. Lucy, welcome to the Advanced Podcast.
Thanks, Vikas. Pleasure to be here.
And so, Lucy, we've known each other for quite some time, and I am a huge supporter, of CAMFED and what you've done there. Why don't you tell our listeners what CAMFED is, how it came about, tell them the origin story and your involvement in particular?
Sure, Vikas. Well, just going back to the very early days, CAMFED was set up by a woman called Anne Cotton, who I know you know.
Yeah.
I joined in 1994, so a few months after it was registered. And actually, when Anne registered CAMFED, she did the great thing of registering it both simultaneously in the UK and in Zimbabwe, so that it was an organisation set up as equal partners, not as one being an HQ and one being a field office, which was the setup of so many organisations of the day. And so while Anne was based in the UK, I was based in Zimbabwe because I'd previously worked there as a secondary school teacher and had seen from that time some of the challenges that girls were facing. And I was actually meant to be moving on from that to pursue a PhD, but just before I embarked on my fieldwork, I got cold feet. It was part of a program that was being funded by a big foundation. But I had big questions about the nature of the research I was being asked to do, and in an area and in communities that were still very raw from civil war in Mozambique. So I called Anne from a payphone in Harare and I asked her if I could volunteer to help set up CAMFED in Zimbabwe. And she said yes. So I dropped out of pursuing my PhD and the rest is history. And I started there as a volunteer in Zimbabwe and then transitioned to being CAMFED's first employee. And since then, back in 1994, I've done virtually every role in the organization, in finance, in programs, in M&E, government relations, partnerships, you name it. And of course, as CEO. So I know the organization and the issues from the ground up and the inside out, if you like. And yeah, I would just say that when we started CAMFED, we were very much going against the grain, going against the received wisdom of the time about girls' education. The perception being that the size of, if you like, of exclusion of girls was down to the issue of culture, that girls were not in school because parents didn't want their daughters to be there. And we set out to prove that if you took poverty out of the equation, then girls would be in school alongside boys. And that's very much what we found, that it was not the poverty of culture that was keeping girls out, it was the culture of poverty. And so, yeah, going against the grain, challenging the received wisdom, I think is one of the things that has really fueled CAMFED over the years.
And Lucy, we live in a world of doom and gloom nowadays, just a perpetual cycle of just rubbish news everywhere in the world. And give us some bright spots about CAMFED and the cause of girls' education.
Well, because I think, there's wherever you look, there's going to be tough times. And I think particularly when you come down to the individual level and you look at the struggles that individuals are going through just to get through the school gates, let alone to retain their hold on education. But I think it's also in those struggles that you find the bright spots too, the extraordinary courage of young people, of their families, to be able to pursue the pathway of education, and actually seeing what has been able to come through as a result of young people graduating through from education and the pathways that they've been able to pursue. But I would say the brightest spot for me has been witnessing how all the young women who've graduated from school as a result of CAMFED support have not only pursued their own pathways and beaten the odds for what a young woman from a rural area, a poor family, can go on to achieve, but they're now turning around and changing the odds for the younger generation. And we've seen extraordinary levels of philanthropy with every one of our graduates supporting at least 3 other girls to go to school. So I think that's where I find the bright spots, the hope. It's in the activism of the upcoming generation.
And tell me, how many girls has CAMFED supported? Also, not just girls, but also women's leadership as a general thing that you do. Tell me, what is the extent of the impact you've had?
Well, CAMFED has supported over 7 million young people.
Wow.
And within that, over 3 million girls in the completion of secondary school. And the goal of CAMFED right now is to increase that to 8 million by the end of this decade, by 2030. But the graduate network we have, that's just over 300,000 members strong now. And these are women who have all been part of the program, who've graduated from secondary school, who are now in positions of leadership in different sectors, and are coming together to support the younger generation, but also to look ahead and explore changing policy, changing the sectors that they're in to be more inclusive and to ensure that there is equality. So it is a driving force, and exciting to see how that is now taking shape.
And Lucy, look, I remember a BBC report many years ago now that I read that to get every girl into school in Africa, we're going to be like the year 2083 or something like that. That is such a long way away. Why is this the case?
Because I would say that actually there's points of acceleration now. I think we're seeing.
So we're down to 2075.
Well, I think we have to be clear that the challenge is there. The challenge is enormous, and I think that we've seen recent setbacks, what with the pandemic and what school closures have done, particularly for the most vulnerable children, particularly among that for the most marginalised girls, and also with the what we're seeing take shape right now, the tectonic shifts around global aid architecture and how that's going to impact education and access to education. But in that context, I think we've seen a real drive among governments and among ministries of education to push for access, and particularly now as well at the secondary level. So I think that drive for access still has real momentum behind it. And I think in the context now of EdTech, we are seeing new ways to reach those who are most marginalized and new models through which to do so, models that are increasingly being taken up by and scaled through ministries of education. CAMFED is one example of that, with our model around the learner guide, through which young people are now using mobile technology, can reach out, can support learning outcomes among schools that are otherwise very under-resourced. So I think there are points of hope out there for how we can accelerate. And I think it's for us to really double down on that and see how we can be catalytic in supporting the scale of those bright spots.
What is the one, sorry, this is going off script a little bit. What is the one stereotype that you think we should try to debunk?
Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, what I mean is like there's some long-held beliefs, out there about education firstly, and then girls' education secondly, and then thirdly about Africa. And so, what is the one thing from your experience of working in the field, as it were, in these countries that you have operated and you have visited and you have very deep relations in, that actually doesn't stack up, like, in terms of what people believe?
Well, I think because it goes back to that point I made earlier around challenging received wisdom, that very much it's been seen that, culture is a driving force behind girls' exclusion. But I think that's one of the areas that we really need to unpack a little, that when you have people asking the question, why is your daughter not in school? Who among us would say it's because I'm too poor to support my daughter? You will always find a reason. And so I think it's also an easy answer, because advocacy campaigns to persuade parents to send their daughters to go to school is a lot cheaper than actually recognizing that it's the material costs of going to school that are the real barrier to girls and their parents. And so I think that's yes, of course, there are gender social norms that are a problem, but those can be shifted. And I think that's one of the exciting and the points of hope that we've seen, is how those gender social norms are shifting, and particularly now with a generation of educated young women in communities where previously girls had not successfully reached the end of secondary school. That's where we're seeing a real shift. And I think that's when the myths can be debunked.
Lucy, this podcast is very much about helping leaders think through how they drive high performance. And when we talk about this subject, we necessarily, I think, have to also address, inflection points, toughest moments, those kinds of things. And I know that you have spoken previously about some of these very tough moments. And I was wondering whether for our listeners, we could go through perhaps 3 of them and talk through your experience about them. And what you learned in the process, so that those listening can take away some points saying that, okay, this is how they could also perhaps deal or manage with these kinds of issues. So when we start with the first, and you've spoken previously about, in the world of CAMFED and girls' education aid and philanthropy, you talked about the imposition of payments by results by the Foreign Office in the UK. Why don't you start with that one?
Yeah, sure, because I think, that captures a lot of the challenges. And so in our experience, this came through at a time when the UK government, through DFID, was really looking to step up its investment in girls' education, and really recognise the outcomes of investing in girls' education. So it was a great time, with, having been working on this at the time for 2 decades, to really see this opening up as a space. And we were one of the organisations, and I know because your organisation at the time was also in this group, who was offered a kind of game-changing grant to really be able to show what's possible in girls' education and to take that to scale, which we absolutely committed ourselves to. But it became a real challenge in taking this on, partly because as an organisation that had worked on girls' education for 2 decades, we knew what we were doing. We were ready to go. We were racing to get ahead. And knowing that it was time limited for us to be able to reach those girls, to achieve the kind of results that we knew were possible. But the DFID, as then was, we're still building the plane as they were flying. And so payment by results got introduced as a mechanism downstream. And the real concern for us was that it was going to disincentivize reaching out to the most marginalized girls. It was going to create a massive risk for us that if we didn't achieve the kind of very high bar for the level of learning outcomes that were not even seen here in the UK, let alone in the context of rural areas in an under-resourced school systems in sub-Saharan Africa, that this created an existential risk for us as an organization, because if we failed to reach those results, we did not have the level of unrestricted funds to meet the gap in funding that payment by results mechanism would have introduced. So it was a massive risk for us and a big choice that we faced, whether we went down the route of working with those girls who were not so marginalized, who were less likely to drop out of school, who were more likely to see the kind of learning gains, for us to hothouse cohorts around numeracy and literacy. But we chose instead to be true to our principles and to keep a focus on those girls who are most marginalized, and to explore the fact that if actually we took a holistic approach to their education to ensure that their welfare, that their agency was a key part of the kind of results we were looking to deliver, that we would see an improvement in their education outcomes, and within that, in their learning outcomes. So it was a massive risk. And ultimately, it was a risk that paid off. And that, I think, has been something that as an organization, we've really been able to build upon to show that it is these broader outcomes of education that are so important that we keep a focus on. And that, in turn, one of the outputs of that is an improvement in learning outcomes. But it was, it was a huge risk and a real responsibility as leader. But I think it's, worth looking at and exploring those risks if they can be game changing. And so in our case, we felt this was game changing and it was a risk worth taking on. So it did require navigation. It did require negotiation with the donor, with the contractor who was managing the program on behalf of the donor. So being tough was a real lesson, and being prepared to take risks was another.
Yeah, in everyday parlance, I think what we're talking about is a change of business model. The way that your donations or philanthropy or income comes in was fundamentally changed. And you as a leader went from a very traditional model of seeking donations to one which was being judged by results. And that itself is a very brave thing. So I now want to go on to your second lesson, which again affected all of us universally for the first time, which is COVID. Do you want to speak a little bit about what you did and how you pulled through?
Yeah, and I think it's important because that we do continue to reflect on that COVID era, because I think, we have moved on and that's great, but there are so many lessons, I think, to still take from that era, and particularly for leaders and leaders of organizations, because what that did to organizations, and in our case to our client base, was deeply challenging. Is, as we know, when COVID hit, schools shut down. And particularly for the young people, for the clients that we work with, schools were their safety nets. And schools were what was standing between them and, a serious disadvantage. These were the most marginalized kids from within their communities. And schools were a hub for them to be able to get access to welfare support, not just education. And so for us, seeing the school system shut down, knowing what that would do to our clients was a huge issue. And this is really when I think the strength of our team and organization came through. I've always said, quoted that, I think it's an American general who once said, strategy is for amateurs, logistics are for the experts. And I think COVID really brought that through. There was no time to develop long-term strategy. It was all about logistics. It was all about ensuring there was connectivity, that there were networks who could outreach into communities and monitor and ensure that children were safe. And just ensuring that there was that connectivity in inter rural areas and among our network, that was a huge lift. But I would also say on the other side of that, because I think COVID tested relationships in organizations to the core. And there were those who really stepped up during that period. But there were also those who checked out, frankly. And I think it really opened my eyes to those who are really prepared to come together in a crisis, and those who step away. So I think that was a real learning moment for me, to recognize that people have differential ways of responding to a crisis, and it's for you as leader to really stand strong and to be resilient. And frankly, when I look back, I'm amazed at the resilience in our leadership team and staying power in seeing through what we saw through, and then saw the return rates. Over 95% of girls who were part of our program then returned to school when schools reopened. So it was worth that attention to the detail of the logistics, which is where I think we saw the power of what we could achieve through that crisis.
Before I go to the third point, I do want to ask you a question about, did you ever think, what if I've got it wrong?
Oh, all the time.
How do you reconcile in your mind that risk?
It's a balance it's a tension that you've got to learn to hold. Because I think that it's important that you're always open to consider that there are other pathways. You have to be open to the prospect and the possibility of needing to pivot. And so I think for me, that's always important that you're able to hold that tension, that your commitment to the way forward, but your preparedness to pivot if need be. And I think that is, you have to recognize and hold it as a source of tension.
I once had the fortune of meeting a former president of Nigeria, President Obasanjo, and I got to spend quite a bit of time with him. He's considered a legend in Africa, after Mandela, probably the second most prominent president, and I remember he was asked a question when I was with him, which was, what is the biggest leadership lesson you've learned? And he talked about, the big quality that he looks for is to be God-fearing. And I think it speaks to the subject that you are also touching on, which is, be alive to the possibility that there's a greater plan above yours, and be ready to deal with it. So the question I really want to ask you is, I'm interested in your tactics more than your strategy about, how do you go about making decisions? And so take, for example, it doesn't have to be a large decision or a crisis situation. My colleagues actually have a go at me at most times, which is I speak to too many people, they say. But that's my way of actually understanding, reactions, getting inputs, consulting, as it were, as to the course that I want to take. And then I make a decision. What does Lucy Lake do?
Well, Vikas, what you say there very much resonates, because I would see the decision-making process, for me, is a journey. It's not a destination that you arrive at straight away. It has to be a journey. And of course, on the one hand, you're looking at the data and evidence that it can inform that journey. But ultimately, for me, it is about, if you're on a journey, it's how you and who you bring along with you. And so I think that consultation process is key. And in the context of CamFed, we benefit from a very diverse array of opinions and perspectives in our organization. And so the opportunity to tap that, I think, has been key to support the decision-making process, is knowing that you're doing so anchored in that diversity of perspective. So I think it's seeing decision-making as a journey.
So Lucy, I want to go to the last really challenging thing that you and I have discussed about. And I'm going to put it in very crude terms, if you don't mind me saying, and that's for theatrical effect more than anything else. I want everyone to understand, which is this question about, why you, and to put it into context for these people just listening to this and not seeing the shorts on YouTube, Lucy Lake is a white woman from England working in Africa.
I think, it was that question was one of the toughest I've confronted, which is, who am I to do this? And I'd always ask myself the question from the very outset, why am I doing this? And I think, as a young woman, that answer was quite, to me at the time, very obvious. Girls were excluded from education on a massive scale. The highest rates of exclusion were in sub-Saharan Africa. The benefits of girls' education were just at that time in the early 90s really beginning to become apparent. It was a social justice issue. It was one I was very committed to. But I suppose over the years, that question changed. It moved from being, why am I doing this, to that question you just asked, who am I to do this? Who am I as a white woman from another continent, and to help solve the issue of girls' exclusion from education in Africa? And I had already, I think, worked out my connection to the issue. As a young woman, I had been the victim of a crime of serious gender violence, which went to court. And when it went to court, it was written off by that court as down to the high spirits of young men. And I recognized at the time that in that judicial system, there were no women as judges. There were very few women even as lawyers. There were very few women in positions of authority within the health system. Very few women in positions of authority as principals, as head teachers, and even as teachers in the school system. And there were very few girls coming through that school system. And until you had girls coming through the system, you would never see change in any of those systems. Those systems would not really be able to take account of issues around gender equality. So for me, I had the connection to the issue, but that didn't answer the question of, so what is my contribution? What role do I play? And so it was really in confronting that question that I recognized that, I have a role to play in this issue. It's important that all of us find a place in this movement to support girls' education, to tackle injustice. But it didn't feel right for me to be the CEO of that organization in a context in which we now had generations of women who were coming through and graduating as leaders. So it was a tough question for me to have to confront, recognizing that, the role I'd been playing and in building the organization for 30 years, actually now it was the time to step aside. So, my connection to the issue remains strong. My contribution to how to address that issue is what I've really had to work through to change how that's positioned. So that's really probably the toughest question that I've had to confront, because I'm probably still confront. And I think that's important that one continues to think through what and how your contribution can be most effective.
Lucy, we've covered some very challenging subjects in terms of from your own experiences. But I want to focus a little bit about high performance. And as you built this organization, taking it through various iterations, the evolution, the reinvention, all of these kinds of things. Now, what I want to tell my listeners is that one thing that you perhaps may not appreciate is running an NGO is probably the hardest thing you can do, because you literally have to beg, borrow, and steal to make sure that you get off the ground and you serve the charter that you believe is quite important. In that context, where it's a world of persuasion, actually, what are your top 3 lessons for high performance, Lucy?
So top 3 lessons, because I would say number 1 is, you mentioned there beg, borrow, and stealing. Perhaps not the steam, but the begging and borrowing. That I think there's always a drive for accountability to those who invest in you, who give you the money, who grant you the funds to enable you to do what you do. I think the top lesson for high performance for us is actually flipping that accountability and saying, right, actually our ultimate accountability is to our clients. It's to the girls we serve. But I think the key lesson in that is that that's an easy thing to say, okay, accountability to our clients. But what does that actually mean in practice? Because you're not starting from a level playing field. The clients, if you're working with those who are most vulnerable, who are most marginalized, they don't feel entitled to ask for what might be their right, or for the resources to enable them to secure that right. And the power dynamics are at play at that level. And I think you have to, as a leader and as an organization, really recognize that and explore how can you level that playing field. And I think the language of entitlement is important in this regard, that I know entitlement is often seen as in the negative, but I think if we revisit the original meaning of that, it's the right to benefit specified by law. And if you consider the power of entitlement for a girl when she feels entitled to her right to education, to the resources that are raised in her name. That really shifts the dynamic. And I think in CamFed, that's really what's driven us in setting up the systems that can track her entitlements and ensuring that she and her parents are aware of what she's entitled to, of what the resources are available. I think that can really fuel the culture of accountability in the organization. And if you're accountable and in that way to your clients, to the people you serve, then you're accountable to the donors who are giving you that funding. So accountability to your clients and really unpacking how you achieve that accountability, I would say is my number one lesson for high performance.
And your second lesson that I know that you're going to speak about kind of is a commentary on philanthropy. So do you want to go into that a little bit? Given the tumultuous period that we're in, you make a very interesting point here. So why don't you tell us your second lesson for high performance?
Yeah, because so my second lesson, and I suppose it relates slightly to that first lesson around accountability and that we should all be accountable to our clients, is that fundraising should not be left to fundraisers. And what I mean by that is that, I think we need to see fundraising as political, that it's about a redistribution of resources. And for all of us who are driven by fighting for social justice, we need to really take on that issue of seeing fundraising as about redistribution of resources. And because I think so often, and for all of us, and myself included, having to, going back to your first point, begging and borrowing for funding, it is exhausting. And it does feel like sometimes the thing that keeps you up at night, the add-on to what is already a full day in managing an organization, in dealing with the issues that your organization is working on. So I think fundraising is not something that should be left to a fundraising team. Yes, great to have expertise in fundraising in the organization, in setting up the systems, in thinking through approaches. But fundraising is, for me, fundamentally political. I think if everyone in the organization can get behind that, if everyone can see how their role feeds into that redistribution of resources, to acquiring resources for those who deserve them, who are most marginalized, then I think it creates a different kind of culture in an organization. And certainly, and I think for CamFed, where we've seen great success in fundraising, in bringing people on board, is because they feel they're part of something bigger. They don't feel they're just a donor giving money to a cause. They feel they're part of a movement, something that is really about driving a redistribution in resource. And so, that's my second lesson. It's that fundraising should not be left to fundraisers. It's about how you think about that as core to your drive for social justice.
And just for those that are nonprofit leaders on listening to today's podcast, how much of your time as a CEO should you be spending on fundraising?
Okay, so because I would actually, I suppose in some ways, challenge that question, because, I could put a percentage on it and it would be quite a high percentage, but I would also try not to see some of that work that I was doing as fundraising. It is about advocacy. It is about bringing other vendors along with you. So I would actually see it as fundamental across many dimensions of my role. So, it's by far the highest proportion of the work that I was doing. But ultimately, it was about building a culture in the organization. And we see the results in that, in the level of philanthropy now being generated within our network. So the CamFed Association of Graduates, the network that I mentioned, 300,000 strong, each of them are now raising funds to support at least 3 other girls in their community to go to school. So I think that culture of philanthropy and fundraising that you can generate, it is about not seeing fundraising as a proportion of time or fundraising as a separate department. I think it is about seeing that how it can be integrated. The third lesson I would say, because that possibly relates to my point around one of the toughest moments about asking the question, who am I to do this? I think it is about ensuring that you enable everyone to find their place and feel valued in your organization, in all their diversity. That we have to ensure that in an organization we're not looking to create monocultures. How do you build the diversity and social capital? And I think that, there's been a lot of research done about how important this is. I think that the Search Institute funded by the Gates Foundation showed that, bonding is important social capital. That's when you're together with like-minded people. But it's also about the connections that you need to build with people who are dissimilar. It's about the linking across power differences. That's how you build strong social capital in an organization. I think that relates to the point you made earlier, Vikas, about decision-making, but actually it is about how do you connect with and benefit from the perspectives of a range of people. So enabling everyone to find their place and feel valued. And I think as leader, and for me, what has been absolutely fundamental is about opening the door for others to walk through. So yes, it's about finding your place. It's then about opening the door for others to walk through, opening up the leadership space for those with lived experience, for those who represent the constituencies we serve. And that's ultimately what I did in stepping aside as leader, opening the door for Anjali Murumura, the most phenomenal leader who is now CEO of CamFed and is taking CamFed to new places, to new heights. And I celebrate every day as I watch that take shape.
And winner of the Africa Education Medal.
And winner of the African Education Medal, which in turn led to the recognition on the Time 100 list.
Thank you. Lucy, as we come to the conclusion, there is one thing that I do want to talk to you about, which is, what is the most important piece of advice you've been given? I'm sure you've been given tons of advice from tons of people. And so what is the one thing that really stands out for you as piece of advice?
Yeah, because I think it was a very personal piece of advice, which someone once said to me, learn to live with guilt. And actually, That really stayed with me because I think, and at that time, which is a long time ago now, when I had young children, and I was consumed by guilt that I wasn't spending enough time with them, and then this was affecting my work and my leadership in CamFed. I wasn't giving the time and the space to the organization and the team. And actually, I recognized ultimately that I had to hold that space, that you're always going to feel guilty. You're never going to have enough of you to be able to give and do all that you want to do for others and for the causes you believe in and the responsibilities you hold and the people you love. So you've got to hold that guilt and find that balance. And that for me has been the most important, I think, piece of advice to enable me to see through some of the toughest moments and appreciate that, you are going to feel guilty, but you will find ways to mitigate and manage that ultimately and re-find your balance.
Lucy, I want to conclude on this point, which is a happy kind of memory or a happy kind of occasion for you. And in particular, I want to, I know that one of the highlights that you shared with me was about the power of prizes. As someone who's a proponent of prizes, I'd love you to speak about both the points that you mentioned to me, but specifically about that.
Yeah, so happiest moments, because I think they're related as well. One of my happiest moments was in when the CamFed Association was formed, the network of school graduates, when those first young women who had completed school with CamFed support came together, and it was in Harare, 400 graduates, and they really came burdened with questions and expectations, their own and their families, for what they could go on and do and become as a result of their education, but were faced with, a dearth of opportunity for what next. And it was really them coming together and the courage they had in standing up and sharing their stories. And as a result, the connections that were made, the celebrations for what they had achieved, that I think was a real turning point in CamFed. And I think it brought home to me the importance of individual stories and the connections that can be made and the celebration of what individuals have been able to achieve, that in itself can be so powerful and can ignite activism and responses among others, which in turn can lead to more action and the results. And I think that's really the kind of momentum we've now seen in the Camford Association. And so, related to that point around prizes, I think for me and for us as an organisation, winning the Yidan Prize back in September 2020, and it was really game-changing, was really transformative, because it came after a time of real difficulty, one of those tough moments that I spoke about, the period of COVID. And the fact that it gave that validation, the fact that it opened up a new network connections to people in the global education sphere that we hadn't previously been connected to, that sense of solidarity and what we were looking to achieve as a global education community. I think, there's the prize itself, but it's what comes with that. I think is I've come to appreciate the importance of that, and that it does lead to connection to a wide and diverse community for you to feel that you're part of something bigger. And I think that can have a huge effect on not just what you're doing, but in the possibilities that you see ahead and through the connections that you make. So, I've come to appreciate the outsized impact that prizes can have.
Lucy Lake, thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you regarding, your leadership journey, the pains, the successes, the lessons. And I'm sure that our listeners will benefit immensely from this conversation. So thank you very much. Please know that you remain a hero or heroine of mine in the world of education. And that I encourage everyone who's listening to go to the Camfed website, make a donation today, or at least get involved in some form or fashion to make sure that we put more strength to their elbow to make sure that all girls get to school. Thank you once again, Lucy.
Thanks so much, Vikas.
I don't know about you, but I thought that was a really thought-provoking and honest conversation. A big thank you again to Lucy Lake for joining us today and sharing her insights. Lucy shared some very profound insights in the course of our conversation, but these three stand out for me when we talk about high performance in particular. She said absolute accountability has to be to your clients, the people you serve. In her case, girls and women in Africa. Fundraising should not be left to fundraisers. It is political, a redistribution of resources. And thirdly, you should enable everyone to find their place and feel valued. And as a leader, open the door for others to walk through. I think these three profound lessons apply to so many of us and our experiences of leadership. If you enjoyed this conversation with Lucy Lake, please hit the subscribe button on whichever platform you're using. It helps more teachers and education leaders around the world find these important conversations. Thank you for joining us today. I look forward to sharing another great episode with you soon, right here on the Advanced Podcast.